What I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about the economy you're living in right now. In 1929, millions of people went to bed feeling wealthy and woke up completely broke. Not because they were stupid, not because they ignored the warnings, but because they believed the exact same lies you're being told today. And here's the terrifying part. The system that destroyed their lives never actually disappeared. It just learned to hide better. If you've been wondering why your paycheck buys less every year, why owning a home feels impossible, why debt grows faster than your ability to pay it, you're about to discover the answer. And it's going to make you angry. Before we dig deeper into this, I want to know something. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I'm genuinely curious how far these stories travel across the globe. And if content like this resonates with you, hit that subscribe button because what you're about to learn will completely transform how you interpret every single headline about money, markets, and power. Let's rewind to 1929. The entire world was drunk on optimism. Stock prices were climbing relentlessly. Regular people, not just the wealthy, teachers, factory workers, farmers, were purchasing shares they barely understood. They were borrowing money they didn't have to bet on a market that seemed incapable of falling. The newspapers were calling it a revolutionary new age of prosperity. Does any of this sound eerily familiar to you? Everyone had convinced themselves that the traditional rules of economics no longer applied. Innovation was exploding. Money was cheap to borrow. Politicians stood on stages promising unlimited economic expansion. And underneath it all, invisible to most, the same destructive pattern was forming. Mountains of debt stacked precariously on top of more debt, held together by nothing but collective confidence and wishful thinking. In the years before the crash, the speculation wasn't confined to the stock market. Real estate prices skyrocketed. Banks handed out loans to anyone with a pulse. Companies inflated their profit statements. Average consumers purchased luxury goods on payment plans they could barely afford. It was an entire culture built on borrowed optimism and leveraged dreams. And like every debt-fueled party throughout history, it ended exactly the way it always does. October 1929 arrived, and suddenly, without warning, panic gripped the markets. Investors stampeded toward the exits, desperately trying to sell. Prices didn't just fall, they collapsed. Within a matter of days, billions upon billions in paper wealth simply evaporated into thin air. The system that had appeared invincible just weeks earlier cracked wide open, revealing nothing but emptiness at its core. But here's the critical part that matters for your life right now. The crash itself wasn't what caused the Great Depression. It was merely a symptom of something far more dangerous. The real disease was the fundamental structure of the economy. Too much debt. Too little real income. Too much blind faith in markets that only go up. Are you starting to see the pattern yet? Today we're watching the exact same conditions unfold, just wearing different costumes. Instead of ticker tape machines and telegraph wires, we have trading apps and cryptocurrency charts. Instead of margin loans from brokers, we have credit cards, mortgages, student loans, and governments running trillion-dollar deficits. And the illusion is more powerful than it's ever been. Modern economies survive on consumption, but consumption requires confidence, and confidence is incredibly fragile. When people believe the system is secure, they borrow freely, spend aggressively, and invest optimistically. The moment they start doubting, everything freezes solid. That's exactly what happened in 1929. And it's precisely what keeps economists awake at night today. The real danger isn't the crash itself. It's what happens when trust vanishes completely. Because when nobody believes the system will survive, they stop participating in it entirely. And that's when everything falls apart. Let's examine debt more closely. In 1929, American household debt had reached levels nobody had ever seen before. People were buying automobiles, radios, and houses they absolutely could not afford, convinced that wages and prices would rise indefinitely. Fast forward to 2025, and global debt now exceeds 300% of the entire world's GDP. The pattern hasn't evolved at all. We're still spending tomorrow's earnings to finance today's lifestyle. Back then, banks packaged risky loans and sold them as golden opportunities. Today they do the exact same thing, just with more complicated financial instruments and fancier names. The tools change. The psychology never does. During the 1920s, inequality reached unprecedented heights. A tiny group of elites controlled the vast majority of the nation's wealth. Meanwhile, the working class barely survived on credit and hope. When the bubble finally burst, they had absolutely nothing to cushion the fall. Look around you right now. The top 1% controls more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. Corporate profits shatter records year after year while wages remain stagnant. The middle class is being crushed, forced to rely on debt just to maintain the appearance of stability. It's the exact same script, just updated for a new generation. In the late 1920s, the Federal Reserve kept interest rates artificially low to stimulate growth, then suddenly raised them sharply when inflation started appearing. The result was a brutal liquidity crunch that strangled credit markets and triggered mass panic. Today, central banks face the identical dilemma. Do they print more money to keep markets artificially inflated, or do they raise rates to control inflation? Knowing both choices carry catastrophic consequences, history is replaying itself in slow motion, right before our eyes. And then there's speculation. In 1929, people dumped their life savings into stocks they didn't remotely understand simply because everyone else was doing it. Today, it's meme stocks, NFTs, and crypto bubbles. The psychology is absolutely identical. Fear of missing out. Pure greed. And unwavering belief in effortless wealth. When prices rise, people convince themselves they're geniuses. When prices collapse, they realize they were just lucky. Until they weren't. The Great Depression revealed one brutally uncomfortable truth. When systems become too unequal and too dependent on leverage, they eventually collapse under their own weight. The question has never been if. It's always been when. And if we're being honest with ourselves, most of the world's economies today are running entirely on borrowed confidence. The warning signs are everywhere. Record-breaking household debt, increasing corporate defaults, governments printing money at speeds that would have been unthinkable just decades ago. But there's one crucial difference between then and now. In 1929, the financial system was relatively small and contained. When it imploded, it destroyed millions of lives. Today the system is global and interconnected. A shock in one country ripples across every continent in seconds. That makes the stakes exponentially higher. What happened in 1929 wasn't just a financial catastrophe. It was a failure of imagination. People genuinely believed that prosperity was permanent and irreversible. They couldn't see how fragile the entire structure actually was. We're making the exact same mistake today. We trust central banks and politicians to keep everything stable and functioning. But stability built entirely on debt and speculation isn't real stability. It's just borrowed time ticking away. The lesson of 1929 was never truly learned. It was simply forgotten and buried. Because every new generation believes they're smarter than the previous one. That they've engineered a safer, more sophisticated system. That this time really is different. But the patterns tell a very different story. The Great Depression started with just a few terrible days on Wall Street. But it ended with years and years of devastating hardship, deflation, and shattered trust. The real danger isn't history repeating itself exactly. It's us repeating the same mistakes that created history in the first place. And if those same forces are gathering strength again, the question becomes, what happens when the illusion finally breaks this time? By the early 1930s, the illusion had been completely shattered. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. Banks failed by the thousands. Families lost their homes, their savings, and their hope. What started as a financial panic rapidly evolved into a full-scale social crisis that threatened the fabric of society itself. Governments scrambled desperately to respond, but their tools were primitive and blunt. They slashed spending, trying to balance budgets. They erected tariffs attempting to protect domestic industries. And they watched, helplessly, as unemployment climbed to unimaginable levels. In their terror of short-term chaos, they actually deepened and prolonged the collapse. The Great Depression became a decade-long open wound that fundamentally reshaped politics, economics, and faith in capitalism itself. But here's the deeply uncomfortable truth you need to understand. The exact same logic is visible in policy decisions today. When cracks begin appearing, policymakers reach for the identical playbook: print more money, cut interest rates to zero or below, promise stability and recovery. They treat symptoms while ignoring root causes. The global economy now floats on mountains of debt that will mathematically never be repaid, held together only by central bank intervention and public belief. That belief is far more fragile than anyone wants to admit. And when it finally breaks, history doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes perfectly. Let's talk about speculation and leverage. In the 1920s, investors were borrowing 90% of the value of the stocks they purchased. When prices fell even slightly, their loans were immediately called in. Margin calls cascaded through the system like dominoes, forcing desperate liquidation and triggering an unstoppable downward spiral. In modern markets, leverage hasn't disappeared. It's just hidden behind layers of complexity. Hedge funds, derivatives, shadow banking systems. They magnify small market shocks into systemic existential threats. The mechanisms have evolved and become more sophisticated. But the core danger remains absolutely unchanged. Too much risk. Too little transparency. Too much confidence in mathematical models built entirely on optimistic assumptions. When reality shifts even slightly, those assumptions implode spectacularly. During the Great Depression, trust collapsed first in the markets, then in the institutions themselves. Banks literally closed their doors overnight, locking depositors out from their own money. In response, the U.S. government created the FDIC to guarantee deposits. It worked reasonably well for a while. But today, the scale is entirely different. Banking is global and instantaneous. When Silicon Valley Bank failed in 2023, panic spread across international borders within minutes. The same primal fear of invisible losses, of vanishing safety, still lurks just beneath the surface of every banking system. What made 1929 so catastrophically dangerous wasn't purely financial. It was deeply psychological. The belief in endless progress had essentially become a religion. Prosperity was treated as destiny, not possibility. When that myth shattered into pieces, people didn't just lose money. They lost all trust in the system itself. The institutions, the rules, the promises, everything. The danger we face today follows a similar pattern. For decades now, we've been repeatedly told that central banks can control economic cycles, that policymakers possess the tools to smooth out any downturn, that severe recessions are relics of a primitive past. Yet every fix requires more debt, more intervention, and more distortion of natural market signals. Each rescue operation plants the seeds for an even larger collapse down the road. The Great Depression also brutally revealed just how interconnected global economies had already become. When American markets collapsed, European banks, already drowning under war debt, failed immediately. Germany spiraled into complete crisis. That economic collapse fed mass resentment, political extremism, and eventually, catastrophic conflict. The world learned the hard way that economic pain never stays contained within borders. Fast forward to our present moment. Global debt now exceeds $300 trillion. A crisis in any corner of the world, a sovereign default, a currency collapse, a major bank failure, can ripple across the entire planet instantly. The architecture is vastly larger and more complex, but it's not one bit sturdier or more resilient. In 1929, policymakers genuinely believed they could restore confidence through reassuring speeches and minor interventions. They completely misunderstood the disease they were treating. It wasn't irrational panic. It was catastrophic over-leverage. People weren't behaving irrationally. They were simply overexposed to risk they didn't fully comprehend. The exact same dynamic applies right now. Central banks flood markets with unlimited liquidity, desperately hoping that optimism will somehow rebuild itself organically. But liquidity is absolutely not the same as solvency. Printing money does not create real underlying value. It merely delays the recognition of losses. And the longer that recognition is delayed, the more violent and destructive the eventual correction becomes. Here's another haunting echo from history. In the 1920s, asset prices soared astronomically beyond any rational fundamentals. Investors justified these valuations by claiming, "This time is different." New technology, new management techniques, new government policies, all of it supposedly made the old rules obsolete and irrelevant. Sound painfully familiar? Today, valuations are once again stretching the boundaries of logic. Companies lose billions of dollars year after year, yet trade at record high valuations because markets assume endless future growth. The same dangerous optimism blinds investors to obvious fragility. The names have changed from RCA and Bethlehem Steel to Tesla and venture-backed startups with no path to profitability. But the underlying psychology is absolutely identical. Debt bubbles always, without exception, end the same way. Confidence breaks. Credit tightens. Prices fall. The only variable is timing. In 1929, it happened suddenly and violently. In modern times, it might unfold more gradually, masked temporarily by aggressive policy support. But basic arithmetic cannot be defeated. If debt grows faster than income, repayment eventually becomes mathematically impossible. If growth depends entirely on credit expansion, then stability becomes nothing more than illusion. We are repeating the exact same structural mistakes that doomed the 1920s. We're just doing it at planetary scale with far more sophisticated tools. Another critical similarity is inequality. Before the 1929 crash, the wealth gap had reached extreme levels. The rich speculated wildly in stock markets. The poor barely survived on installment loans and prayer. When the crash finally came, the losses were devastatingly uneven. The wealthy lost fortunes. The poor lost everything. Today, inequality is measurably worse. The top 1% owns more than half of all global wealth. Asset price inflation rewards those who already own assets. Wages stagnate or decline in real terms. Debt fills the widening gap. The middle class feels temporarily wealthier when home prices rise, but that wealth is entirely borrowed against future earnings. When interest rates inevitably rise, the illusion evaporates. The social fabric begins tearing apart. The Great Depression gave birth to populism and protectionism across the globe. People turned inward, angrily blaming foreigners, elites, or systems they didn't understand. We're witnessing the exact same sentiment growing again right now. Deep distrust in institutions, rage at inequality, fear of change. Economic insecurity breeds political extremism. History provides a very clear warning about what follows when widespread pain collides with desperate politics. Back then, governments tried austerity, cutting spending dramatically to restore market confidence. It failed catastrophically. Today, leaders face the opposite trap: infinite spending financed entirely by printing money. Both paths ultimately lead to collapse, one through deflation and despair, the other through inflation and slow decay. Sustainable prosperity requires careful balance. Debt must serve productive investment, not reckless speculation. Policy must favor long-term stability over short-term political gains. Yet political incentives consistently reward the opposite approach. In 1929, speculation was highly visible. Crowds physically gathered outside brokerage houses watching ticker tape machines roll by. Today, speculation is invisible and digital. Instant trades executed by algorithms. Bets stacked upon bets, derivatives upon derivatives. The speed dramatically magnifies underlying fragility. And when market sentiment suddenly turns, there's literally no time for humans to react. Markets now move faster than human comprehension allows. That velocity virtually guarantees that the next crash, whenever it arrives, will spread globally before most people even realize it has begun. But perhaps the single most dangerous parallel lies in collective psychology. Right before every major collapse throughout history, people feel safest. They believe wholeheartedly in progress, technology, and control. They dismiss warnings as pessimism or jealousy. In the 1920s, those who sold early and took profits were openly mocked as cowards. In 2025, those who speak seriously about bubbles face the exact same ridicule and dismissal. Confidence blinds, complacency builds invisibly, and then one day, without warning, something breaks. A major default, a failed bond auction, a sudden evaporation of liquidity, and the illusion vanishes instantly like smoke. Yet history is not destiny. The lessons exist clearly for anyone willing to look. Diversify risk intelligently. Question consensus thinking. Understand deeply that value depends entirely on trust, and trust depends on discipline. The system doesn't fail when markets fall. It fails when people forget why they rose in the first place. In 1929, absolutely no one imagined a full decade of grinding depression ahead. In 2025, very few are imagining anything similar. And that's precisely what makes this echo so dangerous. Familiarity breeds blindness and complacency. So as debt continues mounting, as speculation accelerates, and as inequality deepens further, ask yourself this fundamental question. Are we genuinely wiser than those who came before us? Or are we simply repeating their exact mistakes with better technology and more sophisticated language? When the dust finally settled after 1929, it wasn't only investment portfolios that had been destroyed. It was faith itself, faith in the market, faith in leadership, faith in the fundamental promise that hard work alone could secure prosperity. The collapse forced entire nations to completely reconsider everything they believed about money, power, and economic organization. The United States dramatically reinvented itself through the New Deal. It introduced comprehensive regulation, deposit insurance, social safety nets. These reforms didn't end the Depression immediately, but they slowed the bleeding and established new rules of the game. For the first time in American history, the state formally accepted responsibility for economic stability. Yet even those well-intentioned solutions carried seeds of future fragility embedded within them. Once governments discovered they could manipulate markets to create the appearance of stability, they never stopped. Look honestly at where we stand right now. The foundations built in the 1930s still fundamentally shape our present reality. Central banks create unlimited liquidity whenever panic threatens. Governments spend trillions to artificially stimulate demand. Investors confidently expect rescue operations. The moral hazard has become permanent and embedded. Risk gets socialized across society. Rewards remain stubbornly private. In 1929, this would have been absolutely unthinkable. In 2025, it's simply assumed as normal. This is how history gradually drifts and transforms. Emergency measures become permanent doctrine. What was once considered exceptional becomes routine procedure. The Depression taught leaders one brutally clear lesson above all others. Deflation kills economies. When prices persistently fall, people hoard cash. Businesses delay all investment. Unemployment spirals upward uncontrollably. To prevent that specific nightmare scenario, modern economies now actively embrace inflation as not just normal, but desirable. But this tolerance carries enormous hidden costs. Persistent inflation silently erodes savings. It rewards debtors and punishes the prudent. It shifts wealth invisibly upward from savers to borrowers, from workers to asset owners. The system now depends entirely on this hidden wealth transfer continuing indefinitely. It cannot allow prices to fall naturally, even when underlying fundamentals scream that correction is necessary. That's precisely why crises today end with massive bailouts instead of bankruptcies and restructuring. Back in 1929, markets were smaller and more contained. The damage, though absolutely massive, remained largely national in scope. Today, markets are genuinely planetary. Capital flows move in microseconds. Derivatives contracts tie banks across continents into a single nervous system. A policy mistake in Washington ricochets to Frankfurt, Beijing, and São Paulo within minutes. The interconnection that was built to spread prosperity now multiplies risk exponentially. When one critical link fails, contagion spreads instantly. That's why relatively small crises now trigger global tremors. The Great Depression fundamentally reshaped geopolitics. Economic collapse directly fueled nationalism, protectionism, and eventually armed conflict. Desperate populations embraced authoritarian strongmen who promised certainty and control. In our current era, the parallels grow sharper and more concerning every year. Economic anxiety breeds political extremes on both sides. Populism rises steadily. Trust in democratic institutions fades. When people lose hope in fair opportunity and social mobility, they desperately seek control, any form of control. That was true in 1933. It remains true right now. The original 1929 crash began with naive belief that markets could always self-correct naturally. Today, we cling to an equally naive belief that governments can always successfully intervene. Both faiths are dangerous illusions. No system ultimately escapes basic arithmetic: debt exceeding income, speculation exceeding production, promises exceeding reality. These imbalances always resolve eventually. The longer the denial continues, the harder and more painful the reckoning becomes. In 1929, very few people understood how deeply intertwined finance and everyday life had actually become. A wheat farmer in rural Kansas couldn't see any connection between Wall Street leverage and his crop prices. But when credit suddenly froze, his entire world collapsed anyway. Today, the connections are infinitely more complex, but no less brutally real. When central banks tighten monetary policy, mortgage rates immediately jump. Housing markets cool rapidly. Jobs vanish. The feedback loops are faster and more violent. The impact cuts deeper. Ordinary people, not algorithms or banks, ultimately carry the full cost. Technology has fundamentally changed the scale and speed, but it hasn't changed human nature one bit. In the 1920s, ticker tape machines spread price information with noticeable delay. Today, algorithms react and execute instantly without any human judgment involved. Fear and greed, once purely human emotions, are now automated and amplified. This makes modern crises far more violent and unpredictable. When trading algorithms detect a price fall, they automatically sell. When they sell, other algorithms follow immediately. Market liquidity can disappear completely in literal seconds. What once unfolded over weeks or months now happens before markets even officially open for the day. The cycle is compressed dramatically. The consequences remain exactly the same. But there's another crucial lesson buried within 1929 that we must not ignore. One of human resilience and adaptation. Out of complete ruin eventually came meaningful reform. Out of utter despair came innovation and new thinking. The challenge facing our generation is to adapt intelligently before collapse, not desperately after. We know the warning signs intimately: unsustainable debt levels, wildly inflated asset prices, extreme inequality, dangerous overconfidence. We also know the necessary tools: fiscal prudence, productive long-term investment, broadly shared prosperity. What's missing is simply political will. It's always easier to postpone pain than confront it, to borrow another trillion, to print another rescue package. But every postponement compounds the eventual reckoning mathematically. If you study 1929 carefully and honestly, one theme repeats endlessly: denial. Influential journalists dismissed the first market drops as healthy corrections. Politicians confidently called it temporary turbulence that would pass quickly. Prominent bankers insisted fundamentals remained sound. By the time they finally admitted the horrible truth, it was far too late. The system had already fractured beyond repair. That psychology, that stubborn refusal to believe, is absolutely timeless. It surrounds us again right now. Market optimism remains persistently high. Valuations defy gravity and logic. Central banks continue assuring stability. Yet beneath the calm surface, strain builds invisibly. When future historians carefully study our current age, they will ask the exact same question we ask about 1929. How could they possibly not see what was coming? The answer will be identical. They did see it. They simply chose not to believe it. Comfort is always easier than correction. That is the core lesson embedded in every major crash throughout history. So where does all of this leave us right now? The global economy stands at a disturbingly familiar edge. Growth slows despite massive stimulus. Debt climbs relentlessly. Inequality fuels anger and resentment. Institutions strain under pressure. Technology accelerates everything, including collapse. The fundamental pattern is ancient and unchanging. The specific context is new. The Great Depression taught humanity that collapse is never only financial. It's moral and social. When trust erodes completely, entire systems crumble into dust. The challenge facing us today is preserving that fragile trust before another devastating reckoning forces painful renewal. If you've followed along this far, take a moment right now. Look honestly at your own economy, your savings, your prices, your opportunities. The ghost of 1929 isn't safely contained in history books gathering dust. It's embedded in every decision to chase profit without foundation, to ignore clear warnings for temporary comfort, to treat reckless speculation as productive growth. Crashes never emerge from nowhere without warning. They grow quietly and invisibly inside collective belief and shared delusion. So ask yourself this final uncomfortable question. If the exact conditions of 1929 returned today, would we even notice? Or have we built a system so complex, so confident, so wrapped in sophisticated language that it can no longer see its own reflection clearly? The answer to that question may ultimately decide whether the next decade repeats the catastrophic past or finally learns from it. If this made you think differently about today's economy and your place in it, share your honest thoughts below. Are we genuinely wiser now? Or are we just walking the exact same path wearing better suits and using fancier words? Your perspective genuinely matters because history isn't over. It's not safely in the past. It's repeating itself right now in slow motion. And this time, we don't have the excuse of ignorance.